permission to become the host.
Here we go. I think it shows a red box now. Do you guys see that?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
You're recording now.
Okay.
Thank you, Jennifer.
People who will be watching this later and you missed the first section. You didn't miss very much. So what supports your client will need during an interview, and what different types of tools you can create for them. Do you have their resume and video resume accessible? Are you familiar with their experience and their work history? And does the employer need to know anything? These are all topics that we will be discussing. So when we're talking about the site environment, is it inside or outside? That's a big thing for how you're dressing. Do you need to be dressed for an outside interview? I've been in 90 degrees sitting there sweating because I did not realize I was going to be outside. I thought I was going to be inside, and I was wearing a jacket and everything. Is it going to be really loud? Are there machines and music playing in the background? There was a time when there was an interview done at a Starbucks, and they sat like right below a music speaker, and the interviewee started rocking back and forth a lot. And so the EC asked, like, is this kind of too much for you? And the client said, I have autism and this is way too much. So they ended up moving, and then the rest of the interview went a way better. So just keeping things like that in mind. Will there be a panel interview? How many people are going to be there? Are there bright fluorescent lights? Is that something that is going to bother your client or be something that distracts them? Are there stairs or elevators? I have lots of examples and stories, and I would just like to thank Wendy from Clark, because a lot of these came from her, and she's awesome. She said that one time there was an interview, and that they got to the interview and there needed to be, they had to go upstairs, but the stairs were locked, and the client was really afraid of the elevator. And had they gone in beforehand, they would have known that there were keys that they could get to open up the stairs. But because the EC was running a little late and everything, the client ended up being about 10 minutes late to the interview because they had to do the elevators all by themselves. And what do you do when you arrive on site? So are you checking in with the front desk person and staying in a waiting room and waiting for them to come and get you? Do you need to go to the third floor? Just knowing all of these things beforehand. The different types of interviews. There's phone interviews, working interviews. When you're doing working interviews, really making sure, what safety things do you need to know? Would a safety audit be beneficial? Maybe that's something you want to do. Making sure you know what tasks will be done during the working interview, and that you can prepare yourself so that you can provide support to the client. You don't want them like failing or just doing something and winging it all. Is there a panel interview? Are there going to be 5 people, or are there going to be 10 people? Are there going to be one person asking questions, or is it going to be everybody rotating? A new one for me that I just experienced about a month and a half ago was a recorded video interview. So they record a person asking a question, and then you have 30 seconds to think of an answer, and then you record your answer, but you're able to re-record as many times as you'd like. And then you submit whichever one you find that you like the most. And then video interviews, maybe just having like on a Zoom or a Skype, and making sure that when you're practicing with your client for these mock interviews, that you are practicing being in front of a camera, because it is such a weird dynamic and not normal. And then there's also like touring interviews, and things to keep in mind with the touring interview is that you're changing your environment a lot. There could be, your client could become like overstimulated, or just thinking of, if you're coming from like fluorescent hallway, and then all of a sudden you walk into a really loud warehouse, and then just all the different changes that are happening in your environment around them, and just trying to be as prepared as you possibly can for that. Tools for your clients. I just want to say firsthand before I go on this, we're going to talk about tools later, so this is just a really brief thing about it. Does your client need a one-pager tool for them? I have one on here to show later. Does your client need a communication device with a folder section for interviews that you should be creating? Does your client need something to fidget with in their hands if they're nervous and that's just what they do? A good example of something for that is there was a client who had like lots and lots of energy and was constantly moving their hands, and during the mock interviews, they realized that the resume that they had started getting like crumpled up and all wrinkly and didn't look very nice. And so the EC practiced during the mock interviews that they would give the resume and their card to the client right before walking in. And one of the first things the clients did was hand over the resume and the card. And then they had something like plastic in their hands that they could kind of twist and turn, and then it wasn't loud and it wasn't obvious and it wasn't them twisting their own clothes. So then it's really obvious when they stand up. Just different things like that. For thinking of getting the resume and video resume already, do you have their resume on you? And do you have their video resume on like your phone or your iPad? It's really important that you have them downloaded. The worst thing is when you go in there and then you think that they'll have internet and all of a sudden they don't, and then you're stuck with this really cool idea and nothing to show for it. The video resumes are kind of difficult to make, so it's fun to be able to show them. Their work history and experience. Make sure you're super familiar with their work history and their experience, because they haven't always been your client. So making sure you know everything in their past that would be beneficial, know their skills and abilities and everything, and just make sure you're just ready to brag about them. Our clients can be shy and not want to answer questions all the time, and so it's really helpful that we can jump in and help them. And it's also really helpful when we have to rephrase some questions that you know a lot about their history, and that allows you to redirect and rephrase a lot of questions for them to be able to answer and get the answer that the employers are looking for. Keeps having me admit people, and every time I click, it takes me away from being able to use my buttons. There we go. Preparing the employer. So have you been using the same interview questions the whole time that you've been practicing with, and you and your clients are really familiar with them? You've got these like rock solid answers for them. Maybe you could just give those interview questions to the client or to the employer and let them know, hey, these are what we've been doing. It keeps popping up. Admit people. Okay. Is your client really quiet and give short answers? Maybe it'd be a really good idea to let the employer know, hey, these are the supports that I'm going to be giving my client. This is what it's going to look like. Them giving really short answers doesn't mean that they're not interested. It's just kind of their communication style. This is also a good time for, if they have any communication device or anything like that, just letting them know, this is what it's going to look like, and this is what my support to the client is going to look like, so that everyone kind of knows what's going to happen moving forward. So I talk really fast. So does anyone have any questions or any ideas of things that you have done yourself to prepare just yourself, is all we're talking about right now, for interviews? No? Maybe? Is there nothing going on in the chat box, Donna?
No, Ashton, also you're not muted. Actually, there is one now. From Susan, she said, I've had my client take home the safety gear from the employer. So my client, is there a second part to that, Casey? Could get desensitized.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. And that's especially if they're be using that during working interviews, making sure that they're all ready to go and familiar before they even go in. The more we can prepare people, the better.
Could get desensitized to the work gear, which reduced anxiety.
Awesome. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, I had a client that was going to be taking plastic trays, the clamshell trays, and putting labels on them and tying a string around them. So I actually got a whole package of like 50 of them, and we had him practice over the weekend. So when he came in for the working interview on Monday, he didn't have to fumble through the learning period, so he already had some good skills. So anytime you can get anything for them to practice like hands-on like that is really good. It makes them look so much better in the working interview.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's kind of going with, that's something you do for a job start. And I feel like sometimes not as much work goes into a working interview, but trying to put in some effort to make sure that the idea is that they just get to keep working from then on.
Here's the rest of Susan's. She also prepped her client with pictures of the work site. And Ashton had the person doing the interview take a quick video to introduce themselves and show it to the person before the interview, and they also took video of the office area. Renee says, my client was set on washing dishes. We set it up for him to try out dishwashing, and he quickly hated touching dirty food and getting wet. I knew it wasn't a good job fit, but after that, we were able to move on and find another job.
Awesome.
Olivia says, I've helped clients pick out their interview clothes before the day of the interview to help reduce anxiety. Lindsay says, for the Kitsap County job interviews, we were able to get the verbal interview questions and practical interview tasks ahead of time and set up mock interviews in the office. ECs switched clients to test how they did answering questions from unfamiliar people. And Susan additionally said, yes, I supported my client with social stories where he got to see the interviewers in them.
Awesome. You guys all covered a lot of like the next section, so you guys don't even need my training anymore. Is that it, Donna?
That is it so far, yeah.
Perfect. Then we will move on. So the next section is how you're going to prepare your client for the interview, such as mock interviews, appropriate attire, practicing any of the tools that you created, and practicing interview questions. So practice some questions, create a list of questions or find some on the internet. I've done both. And then just work on some really great concrete answers that you and your client both feel comfortable with, and keep practicing with those. Maybe even write them down, and then the client can rehearse them later on or whenever they feel like it. Something that I try to do every time is to create 2 or 3 questions that the client can ask the employer. It seems like most interviews at the end, that's one of their questions. Do you have any questions for me? And then your client just has 2 already, and it shows they're really interested and they're really eager. And then this is a perfect time to find a method of support that works best for you and your client. Something I tell all my clients is, I'm going to wait for you to answer. I'm going to give you all the opportunity to answer the question yourself. If you ever feel like you need any help from me, you can always ask me to add or answer with you or help you. And if you these admit people into the Zoom meeting is making my train of thought go all over the place. Sorry, bear with me. If you have any, and if I feel like your answer could be expanded on, or there's any information that you're missing that would be really beneficial, I'm always going to ask you first if I can chime in and add some things. And this is also a great time to, maybe you can create some nonverbal cues on, I don't know, maybe they look at you for 3 seconds and that's a cue of that they need help, or whatever you come up with. It's also a really good time to discuss boundaries and etiquette before going into an interview, even a mock interview. Like, make sure you're not interrupting the employer when they're asking you questions, and here's just some walk in and try and shake their hand if that's something they're comfortable with, and all of that. Just having them as prepared as possible. Practice using the tools that you've created. Does your client have a one-pager? Again, I will be showing you what one of those looks like later. And then use it during the interview. Another thing would be cool to have them help you create the one-pager and update that, because that shows like they can be a part of it. They make sure it really shows what they want to reflect of themselves, and it makes sure that it's on there. And then they're also really familiar with it, so it's not the first time that they're seeing it. And if your client uses a communication device, does it need responses entered in? Maybe you have a folder that's interview answers and you enter them in. I'm only familiar with Proloquo to go, and so that's what I've done with some clients. When doing,
Amy,
yeah?
I got 3 responses here in the chat box if you want to hear them about this.
Yeah.
Renee says, I love Googling interview questions for blank. There are always people who write the interview questions and tips and tricks for answering. There are always questions that I never think of that are helpful for the upcoming interview.
Nice.
Jimmy James said, Olivia, I've done the same thing as well. It really helps to set them up for looking good for all interviews they have, and it drives that part of interview etiquette into our clients. And I'm thinking Jimmy was talking about clothing, getting them all ready for the night before. And then Jen Ham said, creating one-pagers for staff to get to know the client. Did that for one client, and also one-pager listing all the staff they might meet. So like prepping ahead of time.
Yeah, I like that. I've never thought of that. That's a really good idea. So then going through, following with attire, discussing what is appropriate for the attire and make sure that it matches the job type. Obviously, you don't want to wear a tuxedo to a manufacturing warehouse, and you don't want to wear jeans and a flip-flop to the lawyer's office. I was doing this presentation with a coworker yesterday to have him kind of look over it, and something that he told me to put in is don't assume that the client knows what appropriate attire is, which is not something I thought of, but is very true. They may think that their dress-up clothes are good or something, and then this is a good time to make sure that you are helping them pick out their clothes. And if needed, you can help them go shopping for clothes. Remember, DVR usually does help with some of the payments if needed on that.
Amy, I'm going to add in, I did one recently for a young lady who went with interview clothes from what she wore at her previous job. And so as I was trying to explain it to her, I asked if it would be helpful if I sent her visual examples, and she said that would be good. So what I did was I just Googled interview clothing for young women, because, you know, she didn't want to look like an old lady, which she ended up thinking she did look like an old lady, but she didn't. She looked great. And so I sent several different visual outfits, and then several no's, like no tennis shoes, no jeans, no whatever. And so she felt that that was really helpful to have those visuals. Instead of just saying, you know, slacks and flats, I sent pictures of what slacks and flats would be.
Nice. And I know that floating around our office, Martin has created a one-pager like brochure for what is good to wear. I think it's specifically towards men right now. But I've also done games during kind of like the discovery process in the beginning of JD, where I just had a picture of a shoe, picture of pants, basketball pants, or shorts, sweats, and a bunch of different things, and had a client piece together what they think an appropriate outfit would be. And then we talked about different places of work and had them piece together different types of outfits. So that's another idea too that I completely blinked on. Moving into mock interview. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to throw these two in here also. Lindsay said Glassdoor will have questions linked to specific businesses from people who have previously interviewed there. And then Ashton adding in regarding clothing, I've told guardians that the client had an interview and said they should be in nice clothes such as khakis, etc., and they still arrived in track pants and old shoes. So maybe even going a step further with guardians or, you know, house staff, residential, to ask if they need help with those clothes. So that's also a really good idea.
Yeah, that is a really good idea. That's also really important. Maybe making those one-pagers and giving them to them. Yeah.
I just had one. Olivia and I, when we first started working with Apple, who had a lot of distinguishing what was for work and what wasn't, there was a lot of problems with Apple coming with like maybe a see-through shirt or not wearing a really low-cut shirt. or showing different things. And so just creating, we kind of did a one-pager social story to share with her. And that really helped for her to be able to understand what we were talking about with dressing, you know, appropriately.
Right. That's a really good idea. See, we're all learning. That's what the whole point of this is. So I will move on to mock interviews. Find a coworker or a current employer if they're willing to do a mock interview, and then have your clients use the tools that you created. Have them dress like it's a real interview. This is a great time to see what do they think is appropriate before you jump in and see if you need to create any of the tools or do anything that we just talked about. And then debrief the interview with your client and the interviewer. It's really nice to have feedback from both your EC and from whoever else is doing the interview. This is also a great time to provide any kind of feedback and on things that they need to work with, because it's a safe space. And then also making sure that you're complimenting them at this time, because it helps boost their confidence, and then they're not as, it doesn't seem as scary once they've done it a few times and they're getting positive feedback. And it's also a great time to figure out your own personal flow of supporting this client. About how long are you going to wait until you think, all right, I might have to jump in and help them answer this question and ask them, or practicing these methods that you guys have created, your nonverbal cues that you're going to give to each other. Is there anything that you need to work on and better prepare yourself so that when a real interview comes, you're more prepared? I'm going to move on, but I think I saw something pop up in the chat. Is it about mock interviews, Donna?
Yes, Jimmy was saying that he's been looking into getting a client into Fred Meyer, and Martin has some YouTube links to videos that show what Fred Meyer specifically looks like in their interviews, what they specifically look for in their interviews, and going over the types of questions they ask. So I was just putting in that if they can put the links in this chat, go for it.
Yeah, definitely share things like that. So, do we have any questions or any ideas? I know we talked a little bit as preparing your client, we already discussed. I had all of my coworkers send me questions that they would like to get out of this interview or out of this Zoom meeting. And one of the questions I actually had no idea, so I'm gonna leave it to all of you. Are there any ideas for interview practicing that is not a mock interview? Does anyone have anything that they've done that's practicing for an interview that's not a mock interview? If there isn't anything or any ideas, we can move on.
Oh, well, there's one. There's a couple. Ashton says she hasn't done it yet, but maybe taking video or finding video of other people going through an interview for the person to watch. Renee says she prints up interview questions. Susan says, I've had several social stories with the date adjusted. And okay, Martin just put in the link to the Fred Meyer interview process. Lindsay has had a school to work mixer where students come to the office to meet other staff and share resumes, video resumes, and practice skills. And Becky says we could Zoom with another EC acting as an employer.
It's a good idea, especially if you're getting an interview done that way.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Then I'm gonna move forward. We have about 20 minutes left. I'm a fast talker and can definitely get it done in 20 minutes, but let's just see if we have any more questions. So supporting your client during an interview. I am support. This is how I feel most of the time when I show up to interviews, just like that. So rephrasing questions is something that's really important, something that probably all of us have done if you have done something, or if you have done an interview with somebody. If the client is unclear of the question, try to rephrase the question. Maybe you need to reframe it with a direct question asking, so what did you do when you worked at Safeway? Sometimes that may be even too like broad or vague of a question. So breaking down the questions, if the employer says something like, tell me about yourself, maybe you could kind of chime in and say, what do you like to do in your free time? What's your favorite hobby? What are 3 words that best describe you? You do something like that, make sure you have 3 words kind of figured out. But just really trying to redo any of the questions and try and get the client to answer independently what the employer is looking for. And then answering questions, obviously always allow your client to answer the question themselves first, and then jump in with your predetermined method of support, and then start bragging away about how awesome your client is and why everyone should hire them. Direct your client to their one-pager if they have one. This is a good way to help them just try to be as independent as possible. And then, of course, always ask before you start answering a question, even if before going into the interview, your client's like, yeah, absolutely, jump in, help me when I need it. Still just ask beforehand. You could always say something like, sometimes it takes a while to feel comfortable talking to new people. Kind of eases the situation. Also, it's like, hey, I'm going to help you at the same time. And then a tip that I was shared with, or that Wendy shared with me that I didn't know where else to put, so I'm just going to say it now, is if a person's uncomfortable with eye contact, have them look at the interviewer's eyebrows or forehead so that it looks like they're looking at their eyes, but they're not. Here is another question that I was asked by a coworker. What's the best way to help a client out when they have negative answers or responses? My first thought was try and redirect them as much as possible and support them to give a positive answer. You usually kind of can tell, or you know your clients well enough, hopefully, before you go into an interview, which clients may be more likely to answer questions negatively. And so try practicing positive answers as much as possible, but we've all been blindsided during an interview. Know that that's not always possible to prep for. My coworker that I did this with yesterday gave a good example of, he has a client that says really sarcastic, negative comments a lot. And so he will redirect, she'll say something like about her parents, and then he'll just say, oh, you have a great relationship with your parents. And that's just a great way to go back to like, this is positive and keep moving on instead of lingering on that negative comment. Does anyone else have any ideas on how to help with negative answers?
I have one, Amy, and I think this really helps. I think it helps if you really know their previous work experience or volunteer experience or whatever it is, and kind of what went wrong if things went wrong. So I had a client for several years who would at an interview say, when they asked like, what was a challenge you had? This gentleman would say, well, I really did not like my managers. And what it was that he was at Walmart and had numerous managers who would come and tell him to do something different than the previous manager had said. So fortunately I knew that, because then I was able to go, oh, I think what you're expressing is that it was difficult for you to know who to listen to when you had several managers kind of telling you what to do all at the same time. And he would smile and go, oh yeah, that was it. And so it's really helpful if you kind of anticipate what they might say, and then how you can, like, how to turn the negative into a positive.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything in the chat before I move on?
No, looks like Martin sent a broken link or a link that went to something else. But Jimmy has put in a couple of links in there, so you all check those out when you can.
Perfect. All right. Another thing to do while you're in the interview is role modeling. This helps both the client and the employer feel more at ease, and it helps people know how to react to an unusual behavior if they haven't seen it before. It's also a good way to show how we as ECs support our clients, and it lets the employer see what that relationship looks like and how we're there for them and what we do for them. So some examples of modeling could be when a client is complaining about knee pain during a tour, just saying something like, are you a bit nervous right now? I've seen you walk several miles before, so I know you can do it. Interviews can be uncomfortable, and that's just a modeling of like, they're really interested in like being here. This is nervous, and that's kind of how this is showing up right now. Also, modeling calming strategies. You need to take a moment to catch your breath is a good way if someone needs to do some breathing exercises. And then being calm and engaging, just to show that it's not as scary as it seems, even though interviews seem extremely scary. Is there such thing as bad support? Of course there's such thing as bad support. Another wonderful story that I got from Miss Wendy was that there was a client who wanted to work at a bottling company really bad. And he finally got an interview, and when he asked why he wanted to work there, he started screaming, I don't want to work here. I'd kill myself if I worked here. I could never work here. This would be horrible. And the employer got up, walked out, and refused to talk to the EC ever again. Had there been a little bit more preparation beforehand, maybe the EC would have known that anxiety and nerves come out and show with this client in that particular way, and then she could have worked with the client or prepared the employer for these are things that he might say. This isn't actually what he means. He's just extremely nervous or has some pretty bad anxiety right now. So is there any questions on supporting clients during an interview, or any examples or stories of anything like super unique that anyone has ever done?
I can jump in. I think it's kind of cool if you have them read positive things that were said about them. If you have anything like that from previous employers, like just maybe keeping track of positive things that were said, and then that way they can either read those back to themselves, or you can remind them of them before they go into the interview, so that way it kind of builds confidence.
I love that idea. That is really cool.
Renee said she showed a video resume of a non-verbal client working, and it got him a job. The employer had a hard time visualizing him working, so this helped him see it.
Mm-hmm.
Russ says, when the client has been fired in the past, I have them always tell the truth about the situation and practice explaining what they have done to better themselves and grow from the experience.
Awesome. Perfect. All right.
Renee, you're not muted.
All right. So some tools that can be used during an interview, which we've all kind of talked about, is one-pager visual tool for the client, communication devices, and video resumes. So here's an example of a one-pager I created for a client. My intent with this one-pager was that JB would have it in front of him, and then just there's the really common questions that are asked. Tell me about yourself, experience from a previous job, what are your strengths, and then things that help him focus so that he can let them know that this is something that I would benefit from. JB had a very different idea of this tool, and we walked in and he handed it right to the manager and just said, here you go. and then didn't really say much after that. But the manager really liked this idea and was able to read through it and then ask questions specifically off of what was on here, which then just kind of led the interview down, and he got the job, which was awesome. But this is what they look like. I know Donna's made some, so they might all look a little bit different depending on what your client needs. So this is just a one example. If you'd like more, we can always send them out. Communication devices. So again, I'm really only familiar with Proloquo to Go, but I know there's other apps out there that people are using. So creating a folder with buttons for answering common questions so that it keeps the interview process moving, and it doesn't take as much on the spot of someone answering the questions as much, because there's already either pre-recorded or predetermined, or however the app is used. And then here's another question that I was asked by a coworker is, does anyone have any other tools or ideas for supporting a client who is nonverbal? And then when you are supporting them when they're nonverbal, how do you make sure that the attention isn't directed directly to you all the time? When I did the recorded video interview recently, was with a client who's has limited verbal speech. And so it was a lot of me talking the entire time, but really looking at him, engaging with him, bringing it back to him, being like, what do you think about that? Do you agree with what I just said? Is there anything you would change that I just said? And going and making sure that you're getting responses from them. And then it keeps bringing the attention back to them and really reiterating, like, you're not here for me, you're here for them. Does anyone else have any tips or tricks that they've done?
Jen Hammond said Simbo Talk is a free customizable app, and she's got that put in the chat.
Awesome. Cool.
I would say sometimes when the employers ask something, sometimes when somebody's nonverbal, they'll tend to direct it towards you. So then if you just direct it towards the client again, like, I don't know, what do you think? Or, you know, if the client's able to, or I don't know, you know, why don't you answer that to the client, and then have them, that way the person that is doing the interviewing understands that, oh, I can ask these people questions, like this person question.
That's another good example of like role modeling what expectations are and different things for everyone involved in the interview process. Video resumes are, like kind of what Renee said, a really good tool to use. It helps the employer see what the client can do. I am not going to talk to you guys about how to create video resumes because we have lots of resources out there. But I will throw in a quick plug that Quick is a great app to use, and I'm not tech savvy, and I can create video resumes at a much faster pace that look pretty good on a Quick. Is there any tools that anyone has ever created outside of the three that I just mentioned that you've used in your interviews? I just saw the chat go off. Is there anything in there, Donna?
Russ wanted to know if you use Quick on your phone or your PC.
I've always used it on my phone. The whole transferring things back and forth is not my forte, so I just do it on my phone.
And it looks like the answers coming up or people do use it on their phone. Susan said she tools that she has created were like picture schedules.
Oh, yeah. Good. Awesome.
And then another one too is social stories is a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Ashton also said, but you can use it on your PC too. It's maybe not easy going back and forth, but you can create them on a PC.
Perfect. All right. So the last little bit that we'll talk about is follow-up after an interview, because that's always really important. So ideas for following up after an interview. I know that these came from my coworkers, of sending a thank you email, sending a handwritten thank you card. And something that'd be really awesome is, if possible, and if it seems right for the employer, having you and your client drop off the handwritten thank you card in person as like a reminder, and then always try to leave the interview with the next step. Then the follow-up is like natural and expected. So when is a great time for me to call to follow up? When is a good time for me to drop by? When can we expect to hear from you? Just different things that get it moving and showing that you're still really interested and knowing what the next steps should be. And you guys have successfully made it through a lunch and learn with me and me talking really quickly. So does anyone have any questions or anything that they would like follow up on?
I actually just was talking to a client yesterday. We did a Zoom meeting, and we did some mock interview questions. But I think one of the biggest things that I'm kind of coming to terms with the whole COVID crisis is that I'm not going to be shaking hands anymore. I think that that's kind of socially going to be going out. I don't think it's going to be the norm anymore. And so, you know, we've spent, you know, all this time helping support clients, and always, you know, my big thing is, okay, shake hands and make eye contact and say nice to meet you. And now, you know, I told them we're probably not going to do that anymore. And so it's going to be going back and practicing, well, what could you do instead, you know? And so for him, I just said, you can just kind of put your hand up and say, hi, you know, I'm Grant, nice to meet you. But I think that that's something that's going to change when it comes to meeting people and interviewing.
Yeah, that's very true. That's a good point.
Can you see the chat there?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay, you could just take over. Oh, I like that, Becky. Let's just bow.
Russ, no, I have not done an interview remotely. I don't know if anyone else has. That's a pretty unique situation, I feel like. Well, if that's everything, I will let you all go. Phone interview is as remote as I've gotten. Yep. Awesome. Thank you everyone for sharing and participating.
Thanks for the information.
Thank you. Thanks for helping Donna. Talk to you all later.
Thank you.